We throw around terms like depression or IQ like they've been around forever, but they haven't, not really. They're all part of this giant, invisible map of the human mind that was drawn really over just the last century or so. And believe me, that map, it shapes pretty much everything about how we see ourselves and each other, even today. So to really get how this map was made, we've got to follow three different but totally intertwined stories. First, there's the wild scientific quest to, measure the mind. Then, we'll look at the struggle to create a common language, like a legend for that map, so we could all be on the same page. And finally, and this is so important, we're going to talk about the people who were completely left off the map and how they fought their way onto it. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Where do you even begin? Think about it. The mind isn't something you can just, pop under a microscope or weigh on a scale. And that was the huge, fundamental challenge for the first pioneers of psychology, right? How on earth do you measure something you can't even see? Well, the story of this whole scientific map-making project, it actually starts, maybe a bit surprisingly, with a couple of cousins back in 19th century England. One of them you've definitely heard of, the world-famous naturalist Charles Darwin. The other was his brilliant and, let's say, way more controversial cousin, a statistician named Francis Galton. Okay, so Darwin's part in this was a total earthquake, a seismic shift. By arguing that humans evolved just like any other creature, he basically yanked our minds out of this mysterious divine realm and plunked them right down into the natural world. And if our minds are part of nature, well, what does that mean? It means our emotions, our thoughts, our consciousness itself, all of it could finally be studied by science. That was a game changer. Now, his cousin Francis Galton, he took that idea and just sprinted with it. Galton was absolutely obsessed with measurement. His whole thing was, if human traits are natural, then they must be measurable. Simple as that. In fact, he's the guy who gave us the phrase nature and nurture. He pioneered all sorts of tools we still use, like questionnaires and twin studies, all in this grand attempt to put a number on the human experience. But, and this is a huge but, Galton's work went down a really dark path. He was convinced that intelligence was something you inherited, like eye color. And he took this idea and created a new concept he called eugenics. His argument was that you could improve society by, encouraging the smartest people to have more kids. A deeply, deeply controversial idea that, as we now know, was later used to justify some absolutely horrific things. Okay, so we have the first lines being drawn on our map, right? Science is starting to sketch things out. But what good is a map if you don't have a legend to tell you what the symbols mean? Exactly. The next big challenge was creating that legend, a common language, a standardized way for doctors and researchers to talk about mental health and illness. And that effort led to something you might have heard of, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We just call it the DSM. Now, this thing wasn't handed down on stone tablets, not at all. The DSM has changed, dramatically changed, since it first came out in 1952. Each new version is like a snapshot of how our thinking about the mind was shifting at that time. The real revolution, though, happened in 1980 with the third edition, the DSM-3. This was a complete 180. It was a total paradigm shift. Before, a doctor might diagnose a depressive reaction, which kind of implied they knew the cause. But the DSM-3 introduced major depressive disorder, which was defined purely by a checklist of symptoms you could see. It basically stopped asking, why is this person sad, and started asking, what does their sadness look like? And the effect of that shift? It was immediate, and it was huge. Once they started focusing on these checklists of symptoms, the number of official disorders just exploded. It jumped from 106 in the very first DSM all the way to 265 in just the third edition. That's a massive increase. And look, this wasn't just some dusty academic argument. This new way of talking, this criteria-based language, became the absolute bedrock of our entire mental health care system today. It's the language that decides what a doctor puts on your chart, what kind of support a student gets in school, and even what an insurance company will agree to cover. But here's the thing. There was a massive problem. This so-called scientific map, with its shiny new legend, it wasn't built by everybody. It wasn't created in a vacuum. It was built on a really narrow set of assumptions from a very specific point of view. And because of that, it often completely missed, or worse, actually harmed, people from marginalized communities.
Let's circle back to Francis Galton for a second. Remember him? His whole idea that intelligence was this fixed thing you were born with? Well, that wasn't just a theory he talked about at dinner parties. It became the actual foundation for creating IQ tests. And these tests were sold to the world as totally objective, scientific tools to measure how smart you were deep down.
But even from the very beginning, people were pushing back on this. A psychologist named Dr. Herman George Kennedy did some really groundbreaking work that showed these objective tests were, well, anything but. He proved that something as simple as the race of the person administering the test could totally skew the results. So much for objective, right? And maybe one of the most powerful, most visceral challenges to the way the map was drawn came from two incredible researchers, Drs. Mamie and Kenneth Clark. You've probably heard of what they did, the famous doll study. The study was simple, and the results were absolutely heartbreaking. When they asked Black children to choose between black dolls and white dolls, the children overwhelmingly preferred the white ones. It was this devastating visual of the psychological damage that segregation was doing to these kids' self-esteem. And this wasn't just some academic paper. It became a critical piece of evidence in one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, Brown v. Board of Education, which ultimately ended legal segregation in schools. So you see people poking holes in the map, but some folks went even further. They weren't just criticizing the map, they were picking up the pen and actively redrawing it themselves. They were determined to add the voices and the experiences that had been ignored for way, way too long. You know, you often hear people talk about the father of Black psychology, but the truth is, it wasn't just one guy. There were several pioneers. You had Dr. Francis Cecil Sumner, who was the very first Black man to get a PhD in psychology and went on to build the whole department at Howard University. And then a generation later, you had Dr. Joseph L. White, who made this powerful case that you can't just take psychology designed for and by white people and apply it to the Black experience. He said it wasn't just wrong, it was actively harmful. And this really important work of redrawing the map, it's not ancient history. It's happening right now, it's an ongoing thing, and a lot of times it starts with one dedicated person who just refuses to give up. A perfect example is the author and advocate Bebe Moore Campbell. Campbell's story is just an incredible illustration of how change actually happens. It started small, at the community level. She founded a local NAMI chapter in Inglewood to create a safe place for Black folks to just talk about mental health. But she didn't stop there. She took that fight from her neighborhood all the way to the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. And because she just kept pushing, her work led directly to Congress officially creating Bebe Moore Campbell National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So that brings us right back to our map of the mind. And the biggest takeaway, really, is that it's not finished. It's not a dusty old artifact in a museum. It's a living, breathing document that's being changed all the time as new voices finally get to hold the pen. And if this whole history teaches us anything, it's that to really understand the human mind, we have to keep asking that one crucial question. Whose voice aren't we hearing yet? What parts of this map still have "Here be dragons" written on them, just waiting to be explored?